This country produces more coffee than Colombia, Guatemala, and Costa Rica combined, and almost nobody drinking it has ever heard its name on the label. The soil beneath it is the color of dried blood, 3 million years old, and it's currently disappearing faster than farmers can replant it. One harvest collapse here once triggered a wave of suicides so severe international agencies had to step in. And the strangest part of the entire empire runs through the gut of a wild animal. Farmers here once burned their own trees for firewood, before turning them into a billion-dollar export. This is Vietnam, the coffee superpower that built itself while no one was watching. Stay until the end, because the final twist in this story is the part the coffee industry doesn't want you to think about. Before sunrise, rows of glossy, dark-leafed trees climb the hills in every direction. Cherries ripening from green to a deep wine red, barely the size of a fingernail. Planted in volcanic ground that formed 3 million years before anyone thought to farm it. This is Buon Ma Thuot, capital of Dak Lak province, center of a robusta empire that did not exist 2 centuries ago. French colonists planted the first commercial trees here in 1857, while Paris still governed from a palace 600 miles north in Hanoi. Today, these same hills, alone, outproduce the entire nation of Colombia. 1 hectare here yields close to 3 tons of cherries a year. Translated, that's roughly 480,000 cups of coffee, grown on a plot barely larger than 2 football pitches. The trees themselves rarely survive past 30 years. 1 hard frost, 1 price collapse, and a family's income for the year disappears before the next flowering. No rain, no cherries, no income. Just risk, replanted every generation. Every tree here is planted, tended, and harvested by hand. No machine has ever been built that can tell a ripe cherry from an unripe one at the speed a human eye can. This soil never asked to become an empire. It became one anyway. Halfway around the world, another crop had already made this arrangement work. Coffee traveled from Ethiopia to Yemen to the Caribbean, before French missionaries carried Arabica seedlings into Indochina in the 1850s, planting them in church gardens for sacramental wine substitutes, not commerce. The soil answered wrong. Arabica struggled in the heat and humidity of the lowlands. Disease tore through the plantations, and by the 1920s, colonial administrators had all but abandoned the crop as a failure. Then someone tried the hills further inland, hardier, uglier, more bitter robusta, a plant most of Europe considered fit only for cheap filler. Vietnam's coffee industry was built on a plant nobody respected. But invisible investment rarely stays invisible for long. Colonial plantations expanded through forced labor, and by the 1930s, Vietnamese workers were dying on French-owned coffee estates from malaria, exhaustion, and beatings. Numbers never fully recorded because no one in power was counting. Then came 4 decades of war. American bombing runs turned entire tracts of the Central Highlands into cratered ground, and after 1975, the newly unified government inherited plantations stripped of workers, machinery, and capital. Coffee exports from the entire country in 1980 totaled under 6,000 tons, less than what a single mid-sized Brazilian farm produces today. An industry built by force had to be rebuilt from nothing. Yet nothing turned out to be more fertile than it looked. Vietnam's government launched a state-directed replanting campaign in the mid-1980s, clearing forest, distributing land to smallholder families, and betting an entire regional economy on a plant most of the world still associated with instant coffee and gas station cups. Within 15 years, production increased by a factor of nearly 30. By 2000, Vietnam had overtaken Colombia to become the world's second-largest coffee producer, a country the size of New Mexico outproducing nations with a century's head start. The bet worked. It also broke something on the way there. But growth this fast rarely stays contained inside its own borders. As Vietnamese robusta flooded international markets through the 1990s, coffee-growing nations thousands of miles away felt the impact before most consumers ever noticed a shift in taste. Producers in Uganda and the Ivory Coast, competing in the same low-cost robusta segment, watched their own export prices weaken as Vietnamese supply climbed year after year. A country that had exported almost nothing a decade earlier was now capable of moving global commodity prices on its own. One nation's replanting campaign had quietly become another continent's economic problem. And most of that robusta never touched a specialty shelf at all. The majority of Vietnam's harvest ends up inside the instant coffee sold under some of the largest brand names on supermarket shelves worldwide, dissolved into a granule most drinkers never trace back further than the jar. A crop associated in most markets with prestige and origin stories runs, at its base, through a country almost nobody credits by name. The industry's biggest customers were never the ones telling its story. Certification was supposed to fix that gap. International programs began offering premiums to farmers who met sustainability and traceability standards, promising a way for smallholders to finally capture more of the value further down the chain. In practice, many farms found the premiums too small to offset the cost of the audits and paperwork required to qualify, and adoption across the Central Highlands stayed limited to a fraction of total production. A solution built in boardrooms thousands of miles away, offered to farmers who couldn't afford the entry fee. Here's what almost nobody explains about why Robusta thrives where Arabica dies. Robusta beans carry nearly twice the caffeine of Arabica, roughly 2.7% by dry weight versus 1.5%. Caffeine isn't just a stimulant here. It's a defense chemical, a textbook case of allelopathy. The plant leaches it into surrounding soil, suppressing the germination of competing seedlings and deterring insects that would otherwise strip the leaves bare. The same chemical defense principle is now studied by agricultural researchers, developing natural bioherbicides, reducing reliance on synthetic pesticide. Which is why low-altitude plantations around Buon Ma Thuot, exposed to heat and pest pressure that would cripple delicate Arabica, keep producing at industrial scale with comparatively little chemical intervention. But chemistry only explains survival. It doesn't explain what people did with it. 200 kilometers south, the hills change character entirely. Dalat sits at nearly 1,500 meters, cool enough for pine forests and strawberry fields. A French hill station built in the 1890s as an escape from the lowland heat. Here, Arabica finally gets the climate it always needed. Misty mornings, cooler nights, volcanic soil without the punishing humidity. Small terraced farms wind around the town. Coffee cherries drying on raised beds in thin mountain light. Visitors come for the flowers and the waterfalls, rarely realizing the slopes around them grow some of the country's most delicate beans. It is the gentlest chapter in a mostly unforgiving story. But even here, the harvest depends on a season that arrives less reliably every year. For most families in Dak Lak, coffee isn't an industry. It's the only inheritance available. Roughly 600,000 households across the Central Highlands depend on coffee as their primary income, farming plots that average under 1 hectare each, barely enough to clear a living wage in a good year. Their daily commute starts before dawn, hauling water to trees that need constant irrigation through the dry season, checking for the borer beetle that can gut a harvest overnight. Tourists photograph the neat rows from the road. For the families walking them, this is simply Tuesday. Yet the money rarely stays where the labor happens. Middlemen buy raw cherries at the farm gate, often below production cost, then resell to exporters, who blend, roast, and brand the beans for markets the original farmers will never see. A Vietnamese farmer typically earns less than 5% of what a finished bag of coffee sells for in a European supermarket. Global buyers pay for scarcity and story. Local families absorb the volatility underneath both. But volatility has a name, and it arrived hard in the late 1990s. A global oversupply, driven partly by Vietnam's own explosive growth, crashed world coffee prices by more than half between 1997 and 2001. Farmers who had taken loans against future harvests found themselves owing more than their land was worth. Some uprooted entire plantations overnight, replacing coffee with pepper, cashew, or nothing at all. An industry that took 15 years to build began unraveling in 18 months. Where crisis struck one generation, climate now strikes the next. Rising temperatures and erratic rainfall have pushed viable robusta altitude nearly 100 meters higher than it sat 40 years ago, squeezing farmers toward land that no longer exists in enough supply. Vietnam's own Ministry of Agriculture has projected yield losses of up to a quarter in the hardest-hit provinces within a generation. The soil that built an empire is quietly moving out from under it. And water tells the same story from a different angle. Coffee trees across the Central Highlands depend on irrigation drawn from wells and streams that were never designed to support plantations this dense. Groundwater tables in parts of Dak Lak have dropped several meters over the past 2 decades, forcing some farmers to dig deeper wells every few years just to keep trees alive through the dry season. Engineers studying the region have floated drip irrigation retrofits that could cut water use by nearly a third, but the upfront cost puts them out of reach for most smallholders working plots this size. A crop that needs water most in the months it rains least. Nobody built a backup plan for the day the wells run dry. Meanwhile, the people who grow the coffee are quietly leaving it behind. Younger residents of coffee farming districts have moved toward factory work in industrial zones near Ho Chi Minh City and Bien Hoa in growing numbers over the past 15 years, drawn by steadier wages and none of the price risk their parents inherited. Fields that once passed automatically from one generation to the next are increasingly worked by aging farmers with no clear successor. An industry that survived war, collapse, and drought may end up short on the one resource none of that ever threatened: people willing to stay. The worst year had a number: 2001. Prices fell so low that raising a kilogram of coffee cost more than selling it. Families who had staked everything on the boom watched a decade of labor become debt overnight. Reports from the period describe farmers abandoning fields mid-harvest, cherries left to rot on the branch because picking them cost more than they were worth. Some households lost the only asset they had. Suicide rates in coffee-dependent districts spiked sharply enough that international aid agencies flagged the region for emergency intervention. No compensation came fast enough for everyone. The soil did not care that the trees had once made people rich. It just kept growing. That collapse nearly ended an entire region's way of life in under 2 years. But it didn't end there. This same soil found a way back. And what happened next is stranger than the crash itself. Subscribe now, because the next chapter of this story is the part most coffee documentaries skip entirely, and you won't want to miss how it ends. It looks like an ordinary coffee farm. It isn't. In a handful of highland operations, weasel coffee, café chon, is produced by feeding ripe cherries to civets, whose digestive enzymes ferment the beans before they're excreted, collected, washed, and roasted. A single kilogram can sell for hundreds of dollars, marketed as the country's rarest export. Most of what's labeled weasel coffee in stores today, though, is synthetic, enzyme-treated to mimic a process almost no farm can produce at scale. The rarity became the product's biggest selling point and its easiest thing to fake. Most of what's sold as weasel coffee in stores right now isn't real. It's lab-treated to fake a process almost no farm on Earth can actually produce at scale. Comment below if you've ever bought a bag labeled civet coffee, because there's a good chance you paid premium price for something that never touched an animal at all. These aren't leftovers from a colonial drink. They're the foundation of a national ritual invented decades after the French left. Egg coffee, café trung, was created in 1940s Hanoi during a milk shortage, when a cafe owner whisked egg yolk, sugar, and condensed milk into a foam thick enough to float on black coffee like custard. It is still served in the same handful of cafes today, largely unchanged, a wartime improvisation that outlived the war by 80 years. One unanswered question sits underneath all of it. Why does a country that exports almost no gourmet Arabica have one of the most elaborate home coffee cultures on Earth? Sidewalk cafes in Hanoi and Saigon serve café soda, dense robusta dripped slowly through a metal phin filter over sweetened condensed milk, as a daily ritual stretched over hours, not minutes. Plastic stools face the street instead of each other. Coffee, in Vietnam, was never really about the bean. It was about the 15 minutes nobody was allowed to rush. Even the filter itself carries the same stubbornness. The phin has barely changed in over a century. A small metal cylinder, a perforated press, gravity doing all the work, one cup taking 4 to 5 minutes to finish dripping. Faster methods exist. Nobody who drinks café soda daily seems interested in using them. Hanoi and Saigon can't even agree on how the ritual should end. In the north, black coffee dripped over ice, and condensed milk dominates cold orders. Head south, and the same base drink arrives whipped into a foam-topped, almost dessert-like version locals treat as a separate category entirely. Same bean, same filter, same colonial-era ritual. Two cities, two rival opinions on how it's supposed to taste. The market has already found a way to sell that same 15 minutes back to people who no longer have time for it. Third-wave cafes in Hanoi and Saigon now serve cold brew and pour-over versions of the same robusta, plated on marble counters at 5 times the sidewalk price, marketed to a generation that wants the ritual's aesthetic without its patience. The stools disappear. The phin stays in a display case instead of a cup. The 15 minutes nobody could rush just got timed down to 90 seconds and put on a menu. But not every part of the story survived intact. Some slowly surrendered to the forces they once outproduced. Older plantations across Dak Lak, planted during the 1980s boom, are now aging past productive life, their yields falling year over year, as replanting costs climb beyond what smallholders can absorb. Entire hillsides, once green with coffee, are being cleared for durian and pepper, crops currently fetching higher prices per hectare. Coffee is losing ground to fruit trees, one field at a time. Some of those hillsides show it plainly. Rows of coffee trees left unpruned for several seasons grow tangled and stunted. Cherries shrinking year over year as the plant runs out of nutrients the depleted soil no longer replaces. A farmer walking one of these plots sees the same signal a doctor sees in a fading pulse. A slow withdrawal of the resource that used to run through everything. No single event killed it. It simply stopped being worth the work. Decades of monoculture have also left the soil thinner than it was in 1975. Continuous planting without adequate rotation has depleted organic content in parts of the Central Highlands, forcing farmers into heavier fertilizer use just to maintain yields that once came naturally. Some plots now require nearly double the fertilizer input of 30 years ago to produce comparable harvests, tightening the same debt cycle that broke families in 2001. Some families stayed anyway. In villages where 3 generations have worked the same rows, a handful refused the durian conversion entirely, betting instead on specialty-grade robusta and direct export contracts that cut out the middlemen who once took most of the margin. Their refusal is small, and it is not guaranteed to work. But it is the only version of this industry where the people who grow the beans might finally taste the reward. For nearly 2 decades, the danger stayed quiet. Vietnam's coffee boom had absorbed shock after shock: war, embargo, replanting, oversupply, without a single collapse severe enough to break the industry itself. Then, in under 18 months between 1999 and 2001, global robusta prices fell by more than 70%, the fastest sustained collapse the modern coffee trade had recorded. Farmers who had expanded aggressively during the boom found their entire harvest worth less than the fertilizer used to grow it. Across Dak Lak, plantations were abandoned mid-season, trees left standing, cherries left unpicked, tools left leaning against porches as families searched for other work. Some accounts describe entire communes where coffee income dropped to zero within a single harvest cycle. And yet the trees kept fruiting. By 2004, prices had begun recovering, pulled up by a mix of reduced global supply and renewed demand from instant coffee markets abroad. Families who had held on, barely, found themselves back in business almost by accident. The industry that nearly died in silence rebuilt itself the same way it was born, quietly, without anyone outside the region fully noticing either collapse or recovery. A red hillside that shouldn't have worked. A bean nobody respected, grown at industrial scale by families the global market barely acknowledges. A cup of milk-thick coffee, invented out of wartime shortage, still poured the same way 80 years later. None of it was inevitable. Vietnam did not become the world's second-largest coffee producer through prestige, climate luck, or global attention. It got there through repetition, replanting after war, after collapse, after every price crash that should have ended it. The world drinks Vietnam's coffee constantly. It rarely learns the country's name. The next time you hold a cup of coffee, there's a real chance the beans inside it crossed this same red soil, survived the same price crashes, and passed through the hands of a family who will never see your face or know your name. If this story changed the way you'll drink your next cup, hit subscribe, because there's a whole trail of places like this one, still waiting to be uncovered, and you'll want to be here when we get to the next one.